What we now have is even better evidence for the evolution of species. The answer is that the discoveries in molecular biology have not only reinforced the conviction that evolution has occurred by speciation, the molecular mechanisms have been found to reinforce the concepts of evolution as a process that has happened.
Is speciation happening in today's time? Are species continuing to branch out? And what evidence is there for speciation?
We've got very good evidence. Epigenetics can lead speciation. That this is a vindication of what Darwin was trying to do during the last 10 years of his life. And I've greatly enjoyed what has been a literally in-depth discussion. Darwin would be celebrating, not because he was necessarily right, he would never have said that, but because he did the right thing.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Rational Anthem, where we speak about current topics in science and rationality. Today, we are honored to have with us Professor Denis Noble. He is a physiologist and biologist who held the Burton Sanderson Chair of Cardiovascular Physiology at the University of Oxford, and was appointed Professor Emeritus and Co-Director of Computational Physiology. He is one of the pioneers of systems biology and developed the first viable mathematical model of the working heart in 1960. He established the third way of evolution with James Shapiro. He is also the author of numerous scientific papers and 4 books, including The Music of Life. Professor Noble is a revolutionary thinker in evolutionary biology. I am joined by my co-hosts, Ghalib, Kamal, and Substantia Nigra. Denis, welcome to the show.
Hi, Denis.
Absolutely
Welcome.
Delighted to come.
Welcome to the Rational Anthem.
Hello,
Hi.
Denis. Looking forward to learning from you.
Yes.
Denis, this conversation was catalyzed by your recent interview with Qasser Ahmed Raja, where you spoke about how the gene-centric neo-Darwinian position needs to be replaced with a more comprehensive framework of evolution, which includes
Absolutely.
the different modes of inheritance. Many creationists, like Mr. Raja in Pakistan, have attempted to misconstrue the debates within evolutionary biology to reject evolution entirely and instead argue for creationism. In publicly available statements, Mr. Raja has claimed that new scientific literature provides evidence against evolution itself. He has said, and I quote, "Evolution is a mythology. It sounds scientific, but it isn't." End of quote. It seems to us that the current scientific literature demonstrates that with multiple mechanisms of transmission of traits and their variation, the case for evolution's strengthened even more. These different mechanisms include epigenetics, the heritable microbiome, along with advances in developmental biology. These findings are in fact bolstering the integrated evolutionary framework by providing answers about key questions that people didn't know before. Denis, would you like to make any clarifications about your position in light of your recent interview and take this opportunity to provide some lines of evidence for evolution?
Certainly. Very happy to do exactly that, because my interpretation of what has happened as a consequence of the utterly remarkable discoveries in molecular biology over the last 70 years or so is that far from confirming the modern interpretation of evolution, which is often called neo-Darwinism, the modern synthesis, it has actually caused us to realize that the processes are vastly more complicated, but also that some of the major assumptions of the neo-Darwinist viewpoint or the modern synthesis viewpoint are simply incorrect. But to answer your question very directly, what we now have is even better evidence for the evolution of species, one from another, than we had before. First, we have the genomic data, which has given us better access to the trees of life. That is the process by which branching speciation has occurred many times. Without that genomic information, we would not have that ability to clarify many of the questions that were unsure before genomic sequencing became possible. The other thing that we found with the advances in molecular biology is that we now can identify the precise molecular mechanisms of what is called epigenetics, which effectively is the influence of the environment on the organism, which then in turn influences the way in which genetic material works. All of that also confirms that what we're talking about is a process by which the molecular mechanisms have been found to reinforce the concepts of evolution as a process that has happened. Now the big question is, how did it happen? The neo-Darwinists will answer, well, it all depended upon natural selection. And it's very important to realize that Darwin never thought that was the case. He may have done so at the very beginning when natural selection as an idea was formulated in 1858, when he and Alfred Russel Wallace presented it to the Linnean Society in London. But he certainly didn't later. But he didn't even do so at the very beginning, because he contrasted it with what he called artificial selection, which is the process by which us, breeders of animals, I don't mean me personally, but others who do this, selecting for varieties that will push the species in this direction or that direction. And he realized that that process also changes the species. And of course, he then puzzled for many years afterwards. How could it be that only humans can do that? No. He then realized, of course, by 1871, just a decade or so later, that actually other organisms can do this too. He called it sex selection. I call it social selection. No, the answer is that the discoveries in molecular biology have not only reinforced the conviction that evolution has occurred by speciation, but also given us insights into the mechanisms by which that has happened.
Wonderful. Thank you. That is very clear.
So, Denis, you were saying that there is a tree of life, which means that we have a common ancestor. And whenever there is discussion about evolution, many people who deny evolution, they would outright say that where is that common ancestor, or where are the missing links, or all of that goes into that. So do you think that all life on the planet today might have a common ancestor in the distant past?
Very
and what
good
evidence do we have for that?
Yes, very good question indeed. I think the best way of answering this is, first of all, to clarify the concept of the tree of life before we continue to ask the question what it exactly shows. To clarify the question of the tree of life, you will find in most of the textbooks that it's attributed to Darwin in 1837, well before he published on evolution in 1858. And what he has in one of his notebooks, based on what he discovered while he was in the Galapagos Islands, is a little diagram in which he says, I think, that's written out in ink, and then he draws a diagram of speciation branching this way and that way. So he clearly got the idea of a branching tree of life while he was in the Galapagos Islands. At that point, he didn't realize the full significance of what he'd discovered, but he did see that it was clear that there were different species of finch, different species of tortoises that look very similar in many respects, but they are species in the sense that they don't usually breed between each other. They are separate species. And what was clear to him is the geographic isolation had enabled the finches, the tortoises, to develop in different directions on the different islands. But then the question is, what could, first of all, give rise to that branching speciation? And he realized that natural selection alone does not do that, unless it has either islands that are very differently separated geographically, or some process on great big continents where species can interact very easily that would enable them to be reproductively isolated. That gives, first of all, the concept of the tree of life and what it raises as big, important questions in evolutionary biology. Now, your question is, does it support the idea that there's a common origin? To the extent that it's a tree, yes, because a tree has to have a trunk. But do notice that some trees have multiple trunks. I have a magnolia growing in my garden. It's got several trunks coming up from a root system that I know is almost certainly a common root system. It's therefore very difficult to be absolutely certain that there can only have been one common ancestor of everything. Darwin realized that, and in the Origin of Species, he refers, because in those days he referred, I think for diplomatic reasons, to the Creator, having created life either once or several times. I can't remember the exact phrase he uses, but he was being cautious. Darwin was always cautious, incidentally. And his problem was that, could it be that it took several processes in the origin of life before it actually took off? And I can well believe that may be the case, because, you know, it would have had to have been a very chancy event. You first have to get various complex molecules to interact in a particular way that continues indefinitely. That's a living organism. Unless you have a constraint, people think it might have been the fissures in rocks, but eventually it had to be a cell membrane in the earliest cells. Unless you have that constraint, the molecules will disperse and nothing will happen. I think it's quite possible that at the very origin of life, chemically speaking, there were different processes by which life nearly got going but failed. Then nearly got going again and failed, or in different parts of the world that happened. So answering the question, was there just one common ancestor, is actually quite deep. And I don't think you know the answer to that. There could have been several possibilities of the emergence of life, many of which may well have failed. I think at the origin it would have been as difficult to predict as that.
Very interesting, Dennis, because I am sure that you are referring to the closing part of the Origin of Species, where like Darwin said that maybe originally something like breathed into a few forms or into one. So probably, something like that. Yeah, something like that. So you're talking about the closing, I think, of the Origin of Species last chapter. So
yes.
Yeah. So this is interesting because what you are suggesting is this, that while there is overwhelming evidence which tells us that possibly there is a tree and there is a common ancestor, but the possibility of multiple ancestors would make sense under this worldview that there have been many failed experiments on life.
Yeah,
I guess
right.
that is the key message that I get. And just for, again, I think this is what you, because I know that in recent times, this is so unfortunate that what you suggest is an honest scientific position, and sometimes people misconstrue. So what you are suggesting, that why this question is difficult and deep, is precisely under this thought that there could be multiple failed experiments where life simply couldn't kickstart to self-sustaining state, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is very clear, Denis, on your part, and I am so glad that you pointed us to the closing of Origin of Species. So Darwin was an excellent writer. We know that.
Yeah. Yes.
Now,
I would like to elaborate on that point just one further bit in response to your. Thank you very much for identifying precisely where in Darwin's Origin of Species he says that it may be one or several. If we find that there is or was life on Mars or on one or other of the moons of Jupiter, it will be exceedingly interesting to know, is their DNA? Is the coding the same? All of these are questions that influence the very origin of living systems. And we can't know that answer yet. How can we possibly know? There could have been different biological molecules that could have formed the basis of a transmission. Some people thought it was proteins anyway. So polypeptides, which are proteins, could have been the basis of a living system. And it may not have needed either RNA or DNA to be able to do that. Of course, its inheritance would have been very variable, but that might have been an advantage in the early stages. Who knows? I don't. But I think it's very important to admit that when it comes to the question of the origin of life, there are many unresolved questions. It's one of the reasons why in an editorial in a journal a few years ago, I emphasized how important it was not to contaminate Mars with the microbe from Earth. Otherwise, we'll never know. It's an exceedingly important scientific question. If we find living organisms on Mars, or were, and we can find out enough about what they were, did it have DNA? Was it only RNA? Or was it only proteins? Or was it something else we can't imagine? I don't know the answer to those questions. My view is that there are many things that we don't know, but that shouldn't be taken to lead to a doubt about the branching speciation process, which all the molecular biological evidence supports very strongly, giving us much better support than was the case 200 years ago.
Denis, one other question naturally follows from the common ancestor question. As we humans, where do we stand on the tree of life? Do we share a common ancestry with other organisms? Because many people, though the science suggests that, just outright deny that. So what do you think about that? And how do you want to convince people that we also are the part of that story of life that was explained by Darwin in Origin of Species and then in Descent of Man? Or we are somewhere else?
Well, it's interesting to note that we share the great majority, way over 90% of our genome with a mouse. You see, and that's true of all the mammals. The difference between us and a monkey is also exceedingly small in terms of genetics. Now, that doesn't puzzle me as a physiologist. It does sometimes lead to molecular-oriented people in biology to wonder, How can it be that very tiny changes at the molecular level can be responsible for such big changes at a gross macroscopic level? But I don't find that surprising. We all are different. You know, even identical twins. I've got examples of that in my recent publications. You can take two identical twins, one who trained as a weightlifter, another trained also athletically, but as a runner. You won't be surprised that their body shapes, their body structure are completely different. They, through choosing to be one or the other, have automatically changed the way in which their genes are expressed. But I go further than that. We are also capable of changing our genes. Now, that upsets neo-Darwinists because they say, no, the genome is isolated from the organism. So there's no way in which anything that happens in my lifetime could be transmitted to my progeny through the eggs and sperm. Sperm in my case, eggs in the case of the mother. Well, we now know that vast quantities of information get transmitted from the organism to the germ cells. I published a paper with a colleague, Daniel Phillips, here in Oxford. It's a paper, Phillips and Noble, you can look it up. Bubbling beyond the barrier. Barrier refers to the so-called Weissman barrier, which is said to isolate the germline from the organism. The fact is that vast quantities of material get transmitted through the so-called Weissman barrier, which of course is a key center stone of neo-Darwinism. That was introduced by Weissman way back in 1883. And ever since then, the theory has been that it's impossible to pass across the Weissman barrier. We now know that it happens. So when we talk about the tree of life and similar questions, it's also interesting to note that even between two individuals that have got the same genome, they can branch out to be very different in what they turn out to have as structural, physiological, and psychological characteristics.
Great. You talked extensively about speciation and how it happens. Is speciation happening in today's time? Are species continuing to branch out? And what evidence is there for speciation?
We've got very good evidence. A lone finch from one of the distant islands in the Galapagos flew around 40 years ago from that island to one of the more central islands. It was a male finch. He did not find any of his own species in the more central island. He did what any good male would do, mate with whatever it could, and it mated with a species of female in that island, different from his own species. Fortunately, the progeny was viable. It doesn't often happen. Sometimes interspecies breeding doesn't work. But here it did. Within 2 generations, a new species has emerged. That's all documented in the literature.
Wow.
We ourselves are changing our species. Just think what we were like just 100 years ago, back in 1924. So many things have developed that have huge influences on our epigenetics, because all of that is subject to the environment in which we live. And the answer is that the environment we live in today, in today's society, is from a sociological and technological point of view, utterly different from the environment of only 100 years ago. So just 3 to 4 generations. So we are changing ourselves through our cultural inheritance. And that means that we are, in fact, evolving. Now, we may be evolving in a completely linear way, our species developing from what we are now to what we become in the future, and no branching. That's interesting, because the question of branching depends upon varieties that may emerge not being able to interbreed. Otherwise, the varieties will fuse again. And breeders of dogs and cats and plants know this very well. You must not mix, you must not allow interbreeding to occur. Moreover, Darwin knew that way back in the 19th century. He knew that if you couldn't stop interbreeding, there would be no branching speciation. Anyway, that's my answer to that question.
Great.
What you mean to say is that in the long run, if the species continues to breed in itself, it will not be branching speciation, but down the road or in a temporal sense, the species would be a different species.
Well, it may, we can't be sure.
Maybe. Yeah.
Let's say what may be the case. What may be the case is that we evolve as a species in a direction that makes it true to say that we would no longer be able to breed with our ancestors of, let us say, 500 years ago. Let's just put it as a notional figure. And I can well imagine that, because you see, the question of interbreeding is not just physiological, it's also psychological. If we met our ancestors of 500 years ago, would we be able, happy?
We might not be sexually attracted to them.
We don't know, do we? We can't, of course, we can't do the experiment. But it seems to me that it's at least conceivable that the human species might develop in a direction such that, by the usual criterion of species, can we or do we interbreed, we may develop in a different direction. That's quite possible. But I suspect with the considerable degree of internationalization that we have in the human species today, that it's unlikely to be a branching speciation. But who knows? That prediction may be wrong too. The world may collapse in the next few tens of years. We could have global warming beyond the possibility of recovering society, in which case we might become isolated again, those of us who remain. I don't know. Who can predict all of this?
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. So just to build on what you just said, I mean, you said that you as a physiologist, you were never surprised that there is so much variation across organisms, despite sharing like 99% of the DNA. And honestly, of course, you are within the field. I, being just an onlooker and just a lay student, it was never surprising to me as well, for a number of reasons, because I think the molecular biological lens itself spells it out. For instance, we will talk about that later in the podcast more. We know that the DNA fidelity, the extremely high replicating fidelity of DNA is actually precisely facilitated through repair enzymes. There's like a slew of repair enzyme machinery. We know DNA polymerase and MUT-Y and whatnot. So if there is a small change, even within a purely molecular biological sense, if there is a small change, one mutation, one change that affects the repair enzyme, its downstream effect could be humongous, right? So
Indeed.
I try to, if I have to explain it further, I would like to rephrase it in this sense that maybe a small step in the repair enzyme kind is a giant leap for the genome, right? So that's one level. And then we have got small changes in epigenetics that can lead to drastic changes in gene expression. And then we have the other aspects which are happening during the lifetime. And in principle, Dennis, maybe we'll talk about that sometime more, because we can keep talking about these things for a very long time. But even in principle, of the whole development, if you look at it, the cellular differentiation was crying out for that. For instance, all the cells have the same DNA, but they are very different in character. So sure enough, I mean, what is a gene when every cell is doing some cell-specific alternative splicing? We know that. It's very clear. So the definition of gene is not very clear. But in any case, I was never surprised what has been like at the looking at the variation amongst organisms that share a huge amount of DNA within two humans, as you just said, even identical twins, even, I mean, our own cells are identical twins technically, but they are very different. So that's one thing. So that was just a comment on what you said, that you were never surprised. Sure. I'm glad. There are no surprises.
Right. Well, yeah. No, to what you said, I can add a very interesting little anecdote. 2 years ago, when I debated all of these questions with the author of The Selfish Gene, Richard Dawkins, he and I know each other very well. We've known each other for more than 50 years, and we get on well personally. We totally disagree about evolution. He told me during that debate 2 years ago, you can easily find it online.
We've seen that.
That's famous.
Yes. Well, Dennis, you know, we will be able to inscribe your DNA, your C, Gs, As, and Ts, all 3 billion of them, and carve them in granite and keep it for 10,000 years. And then after 10,000 years, we will have all the techniques for doing it. We will be able to recreate another Denis Noble. I said, no, you can't. He came back very quickly. Why not? I said, oh, Richard, where would you find my mother's egg cell as it was in February 1936 when I was conceived? Now, he immediately said to the audience, to great hilarity and laughter, oh, we will have the techniques for doing that. Recovering what my mother's egg cell was in 1936. Oh my God! Yeah. It makes one wonder what is going on up here. No, I mean, it's obviously the case that huge amounts of epigenetics information is inherited through the egg cell, not just also the epigenetic marks, but the whole of the detailed membranous structure that form the mitochondria, that form the endoplasmic reticulum, that form the nucleus, the microsome. Oh God, you know, there are so many organelles within the structures of our cells. Each cell is like a country in its extent on the molecular scale, and the detail of what is there, most of that depends on phospholipids, which form the membranous structures that create the compartment. Those phospholipids are not coded for by genes. Only proteins, amino acid, polypeptides can be coded for by genes. The phospholipids are not.
I'm glad, Dennis, that this is becoming clearer and clearer. As you mentioned, that it would be impossible to recreate you, or even if we use paleogenomics to like get some old DNA, just the DNA, it would be impossible to recreate that, precisely because, as you mentioned so articulately, that some of the early things, the zygote in itself is helpless, is absolutely helpless,
yes, right.
Cannot do anything. It cannot do anything. So it is the earlier mitotic divisions and all those molecular gradients that are established within the mother's womb and the local environment of the egg, that is fundamental. And you know what? On a side note, whenever sometimes like it's just statistically more probable for people like us to bump into creationists as compared to you. In any case, so what they sometimes when I mention, or like we have these discussions that zygote is utterly helpless in the beginning, so they suddenly bring in the creator aspect, and usually my response is, okay, I don't care what you think. However, just think about it. The fact that we are discovering every day the role at the level of biochemistry the mother's local environment plays, all the more reason that had it been the case that there was no role from the mother as well and from the egg as well, that would have been a mystery. And then I would let you invoke your creationism. The fact that we are discovering that there are biochemical pathways, actually, it's not a mystery. So just a side note.
Only an experiment that might be worth adding before you come in. An experiment was done on fish nearly 20 years ago in Wuhan in China at the major fish institute of China. They did a very interesting experiment. They took two species of fish, goldfish and carp. Carp, of course, is a fairly elongated organism. A goldfish is much more scrunched up. Not surprisingly, the goldfish has about 24 vertebrae in its vertebral column. The carp has more like 36. So it's almost more than 50% longer in terms of vertebral structure. What they did was to take the egg cell from a goldfish, fertilized, but then enucleated it and replaced the nucleus with a nucleus from a carp. If the neo-Darwinist position was correct, that organism should develop into a carp. It doesn't. It develops into an intermediate form. It has a number in its vertebral column intermediate between the carp and the goldfish. So the experiment has been done. The very title of that paper, incidentally, by Sun and his collaborators, is Cytoplasmic Influences on the Development of the Embryo. I'm quoting from memory, but cytoplasmic influences gets the message. So I just want to clarify that the experiment to test this issue has already been done in another species. It's two species of fish. But it shows the point.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for adding that. I was asking about something that we come across a lot with creationists, and their point of view is that the homology you see in genomics and proteomics, in the sequence of the genes and the proteins between branching, species, is coming from having a common creator instead of, being related on the tree of life.
Yes.
In our view, it kind of strengthens this, idea that there is branching and close homology between closely related species, and the homology gets less when you move away on the tree of life. So what do you think of that in terms of evidence for common ancestor? Is this evidence strengthening the argument for a common ancestor for living species living today?
Their reply that all of that is, as it were, put in by the creator is actually very similar to the arguments that occurred 200 years ago between the early evolutionary biologists like the French biologist Lamarck and his great opponents in Paris in those days. We're going back now to the end of the 18th century, early stages of the 19th century. And his big opponent was Cuvier. And Georges Cuvier was a creationist. And what he argued is that the different species were created at different times and completely separately. And therefore, it would have to be the case that the geological record would actually have to have been laid down by the creator in order to confuse us into thinking that there was a tree of life. Well, I mean, the mind boggles at the number of epicycles you need in the theories in order to accommodate something like that. But I think basically all attempts to bring back a form of multiple creation, as we might call it, of species at different times, possibly even at the same time, all those attempts have great difficulty with explaining the extraordinary similarity at a biochemical and molecular biological level. Of course, it's always possible to say, that the creator was so imaginative that he put exactly identical processes into all the species. Of course, it's possible to say that, but is it a theory that can be tested? And the problem is, it's not. What possible tests can we make of such a theory? It's unfortunately not science. It's what I call metaphysics, because it's way beyond what we can investigate in the natural world, and we would never know. I mean, clearly, if you give a creator infinite power, then he can, or he, she, it, what is it? I don't know. But anyway, he, she, it, or whatever, ought to have the infinite ability to be able to create a complete illusion for modern scientists into thinking that there was a tree of life. I mean, it's first of all utterly implausible. Why on earth should a creator ever want to do that? And second, it's certainly untestable. It's not science. It's mere philosophical speculation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so brilliantly put.
Yeah, so I really liked, Dennis, when you said epicycles in the theory. So they have to introduce all kinds of those gyrations and epicycles into their reasoning just to make things compatible. So
that's right.
Actually, I mean, I am absolutely fine in terms of listening to creation. As it's a difficult thing because of those gyrations, but as I mentioned, just because of the statistical probability of bumping into those folks, those are, like, at the end of the day, human beings like us. So we don't necessarily have anything against them as persons.
Nothing against them.
Yeah,
absolutely not.
And also, what I honestly, from an honest, pure scientific investigation perspective, and being true to the spirit of the investigation, what I like to mention is that, for instance, speciation we have observed beyond any reasonable doubt. We know that. We have seen it. Exactly. It is happening right now. If speciation is the case, then of course there would be homologies across different branches of the speciation.
Exactly.
Okay. Of course. So if that's that forward causality coming from that. Now, it is true that philosophically, when we look at the homology, we are doing an inference. It's an induction that we are invoking. Yes. But that induction to me is strengthened manifold when now we have seen speciation, because now that we have seen speciation happening and we know that if speciation is the case, we would definitely expect to find homology. Yes. So if we are doing a classical Bayesian inference, so the Bayesian inference is strongly biased towards concluding common ancestry from the observation of homology. So that is how I would. Yeah, I like to put it, and having said that, I think we are at a very interesting juncture. I didn't know that we would follow this path, which is so interesting, because as you mentioned, that everyone is different, every conversation is different. So we just talked about inductive structure and making inferences. I would really like to hear, Dennis, your views on the deductive structure in Darwin's central argument. the deductive logical structure of a central argument, that given that there is variation, given that the variation confers differential fitness, and given that that variation is heritable, it's like evolution is kind of a mathematical inevitability. So what are your thoughts about Darwin's deductive argument for evolution?
Yeah, it's a very deep question indeed. Darwin himself was never completely convinced he'd got the full arguments to propose and justify every part of his ideas about evolution. And it's very important to understand that that's what we should expect in science. Science, I suspect, will find it very difficult to ever claim that it has got a complete explanation for everything. You know, we still are not sure what our theories of the universe and its formation and evolution should be. We send new telescopes up there, we find new discoveries, and what do? We reassess the model we've already got to see whether we need to modify it in some way or another to make it compatible with the new findings. And I think there was a similar process occurring in Darwin's mind. He never thought, after The Origin of Species was first published, that natural selection alone could be the complete explanation. Wallace, by contrast, in 1866 said, "No, Darwin, you are wrong. Natural selection can explain it all. Even sexual selection can be explained as natural selection." Darwin was certain that could not be the case. And there were 2 or 3 reasons why that was clear in his mind. The first was the point we've discussed already in this discussion. The branching speciation problem requires separation and no interbreeding. Otherwise, it can't occur. And there have to be processes which cannot be purely inherited that enable that separation to occur. And that's why he was so keen on his idea of pangenesis, as he called it, the idea that it would be possible for the organism to influence the future eggs or sperm in its body. And he stuck to that through thick and thin, even when Wallace totally disagreed with him. He wrote his 1871 book precisely because he wanted to counter Wallace's idea that natural selection on its own was absolutely enough. But did he answer the question, okay, Mr. Darwin, what else is needed? All he could say in response to that was, well, one of my hypotheses, that's the pangenesis hypothesis, is precisely that. It's just a hypothesis. He's had to wait over 150 years for it to be confirmed by modern physiology. We have found the vesicles that are secreted by all cells in the body and that can pass to the germline. Darwin would be celebrating, not because he was necessarily right, he would never have said that, but because he did the right thing. He put up a plausible hypothesis, even knowing at the time that he could not prove it. I think we will always in science have to be honest enough, perhaps even sufficiently cautious enough to admit that we may not be able to satisfy those who would ask the question, but there's always this bit of extra explanation that you haven't provided. I think that will always be the case. It is the human condition that we explain a lot, but we find it very difficult to explain everything. Now, I know that that can sometimes be taken as a kind of mystic view, a view that says, oh, well, then you do admit that there's something we can't explain. I said, well, but that's always true. Why are you surprised by that? It is very nature of science that there will always be. The more we discover, the more we find there are new things to discover.
Absolutely.
Sure. Thank you, Dennis. This is so true that even if somebody is proposing a deductive argument for something, the ultimate litmus test is whether it is borne by time or not, and whether you are able to get the real evidence or not. Simple deductive arguments are not enough. They can be guiding. They can be guiding principles, but still we have to wait. We have to wait to do the real hard work and verify. And on a lighter note, sometimes, like what you were just saying, that many of the things that Darwin postulated, just like you were mentioning these vesicles that we have discovered today, and the transmission of the lifetime experiences of parents to the offspring in a biological sense as well. So to me, it seems, of course, on a very lighter note, that when we say that, oh, you know what, it's the end of neo-Darwinism, sure enough. But honestly, when I look at it, I consider that in the demise of neo-Darwinism lies the resurrection of the original Darwinian thought. We are going back to it. We're going back to it.
Yes, I think that is right. I think that on the way for modern evolutionary biological thinking, on the way to developing our ideas in whatever direction the experiments may now take us, it is extremely important to correct the idea that Darwin would ever have been a neo-Darwinist. What I think the neo-Darwinists did, and that started with Wallace and with Galton and later with Weizmann, is to inherit, as it were, Darwin's great reputation, but not Darwin's great nuanced ideas. And I think it's perfectly correct that we need to correct that misapprehension that somehow neo-Darwinism is just a new form of Darwinism. It isn't. Darwin would never have agreed with it. That's why he wrote his 1871 book in opposition to Wallace, who started the process of branching away. But having done that, and I'm doing the best I can to write about that and to try to reintegrate Darwin's own original ideas into modern evolutionary biology, we then go on to say, but that leaves many questions open. How is it that branching speciation can have reproductive isolation? I've made a suggestion for that in a recent paper. Noble and Phillips in the Journal of Physiology, speciation dependent upon epigenetic variation is roughly the title of the paper. But what we say in that article is this is open to experimentation. We're not saying it's already proven. So I think we need to do both. Resurrect the much more nuanced ideas of Charles Darwin himself and point the way forward for ways in which his mission in life, which was to get a broader and more complete explanation, that mission is still undergoing, is still in process, and it still depends on further experimentation.
Very nice. Very nicely put, Dennis. So let's shift a little bit of gears. And I alluded to this topic before, and I would love to hear your thoughts along these lines more, because I have read your work, specifically the very interesting phrase that you use, harnessing stochasticity, which I really love. I really like it. So just to give a background as well to our audience as well, that what I'm about to ask Dennis, and of course, I always request our audience to listen to the questions and the answers carefully. So listen to the question, and you would then love Dennis's answer, because I think what Dennis is developing over here through these ideas of harnessing stochasticity, they are extremely important, and like I would say they have also got a pedagogical value in our field as well. So for instance, I think it is clear to us that the breathtaking level of fidelity, as I mentioned before, that comes through DNA replication, it in itself is an example of kind of a trial and error. It's not that in the first try that the DNA replication is happening at that level. When I think it's well documented that in the first try, the estimate is about 1 in 10,000 errors.
Exactly, that's the error rate. Yes, that's right.
You see. And then there are specific dedicated repair enzymes which take care of actually proofreading. And as I think, Dennis, you would agree, I'm not using loose analogies. Like it seems like this is
perfectly correct.
Proofreading.
It proofreads.
Yeah.
It corrects each error one by one. Exactly.
So the key thing to remember to our very respected creationists is that while this is like an amazing layer of complexity that nature has given us in terms of repairing the mismatch or misincorporated base pairs, however, one should remind ourselves that this additional layer of complexity is required precisely when the previous layer failed. So this is so important to remember. So complexity may not always be the sign of superintelligence. Maybe this is a sign of intelligence at a failure at a previous level. Just have a philosophical anchor, to be very honest, in terms of interpreting that. So that's my... I have a follow-up point, but I'll let you respond first to this interpretation.
Well, thank you very much for raising this, because if somebody was to ask the question, what on earth is, and some neo-Darwinists certainly do answer this question, what on earth has Denis Noble ever contributed to evolutionary biology? I think one of the things that I've contributed is to draw attention to what you call the harnessing of stochasticity. I first did that in a paper following a big meeting at the Royal Society, that is the National Academy of Science in the United Kingdom, in 2016. And the paper I published as a consequence of that meeting was published in Interface Focus, one of the journals of the Royal Society, in 2017. And it outlines precisely the harnessing of stochasticity idea. Now, what does it mean? It means that organisms actually use the stochastic, that is chance, process in variation to do things that they otherwise would not be able to do. If we were determinate machines, we could not have the creativity we clearly have. That's point one. I think, therefore, harnessing stochasticity occurs at all levels in our organization, right the way down to the water of the cell in the cells in our body. Water itself is a marvelously stochastic process. It was found way back in 1827 that this is by a scientist called Brown, which is why we call it Brownian motion. But the molecules are doing this all the time. And of course, the molecules that are dissolved in water or suspended in water also get buffeted around all the time. This is, in my view, the origin of a lot of our creativity. What do artists do? Musicians, painters, poets, and so on, they also harness stochasticity. They look for variations that are a bit out of the ordinary, and they use them to make, oh dear, how many rules did Beethoven break when he introduced some of his music? How many rules are being broken by modern musicians today? The fact is that we as organisms are harnessing stochasticity all the time at all of our levels in terms of our creativity. That's the first point to make. But to come back to how genes are corrected, that is the basis of the flexibility of our immune system. What was happening during the pandemic? A new virus appeared, the coronavirus. Our immune systems switched into high gear to instruct their B cells and their T cells to find new variants of the coding for immunoglobulins. That's a long word for the protein that grabs the virus and neutralizes it, that would neutralize the new structure, which is that particular virus. Now, what that was doing was making use of statistical variation in the replication process. It's very complicated. You get at a molecular biological level to work out exactly how the immune system does all of that is still an unfinished job. It's still being done. But that it happens is not in doubt at all. What in effect is happening is because all of those processes of proofreading and error correction are under control by the living cell, it can change what is there. Now, it does it in a stochastic way, but then it uses the stochasticity. Just those cells that happen by chance to get the right shape of immunoglobulin to grab that virus end up being told, please reproduce as fast as you can. The other cells are told to apoptose. That's just a technical term for please die. Please enable us to recycle your proteins. They're very valuable to us.
Thanks, Denis. And I think this angle needs to be stressed a lot. What you just mentioned, for instance, it's and I think that this is what you are explaining. First of all, for general audience, stochasticity is just another word for randomness.
Exactly so. Yes.
Just to be absolutely clear, because our audience are by and large lay people. First thing first. Secondly, what Dr. Noble just mentioned, which is so important, I would highly recommend to actually, whenever people are watching, rewind it and re-listen to what Dr. Noble just mentioned. So what Denis just said was that when we are faced with a challenge, like a new thing invades us, it's like a novelty we have to deal with. It's a novel situation we have to deal with. When that's the time when our repair enzymes actually take a break. They take a break. So and the the distribution of the variations that are now being tested out are more random as compared to what was happening before. So it's upping the randomness in face of novelty that is allowing us to cope with that novel challenge. So randomness is the fuel, because if there was foresight into this built into the system, or there was an oracle which could just emanate the exact design of the immunoglobulin and or the antigen, it would have happened in one shot, like in one step. It is precise. So you need a billion shots. Yeah, you need a billion shots. Just like as I say that maybe you do not know the number of the winning lottery ticket, you try to buy the entire lot, or just go ahead buying more and more. And just have and I think nature is crying very loud at us, at a very honest philosophical level. Again, nature is crying very loudly at us that I am admitting I do not know the design of that antigen.
Exactly.
I have nature. So nature is actually crying out and admitting that I do not have foresight. That's why I have to engage in trial and error. That's why I have to harness the randomness. So when, of course, our understanding is developing, honestly, my request, and to all the lots of biologists who somehow are resistant to understanding these things, you know what? I do not think that there is any challenge to biology. We have Denis, we have other developmental biologists, we have other people. We have got Jim Spiro, we have got, of course, other scientists like Kevin Lala and like Tobias Uller and all those people who are actually educating the people with these new ideas, I think the real challenge and the crisis has to be faced by the creationists, because here the fundamental thing that precisely in the absence of foresight, nature has to rely on chance, on trial and error. That is what the modern evidence of molecular biology is telling us. And we really thank Denis. This is a beautiful paper. Those who are interested in the technical side, I would highly recommend to read Denis Noble's paper on harnessing stochasticity. It's the randomness is the fuel that allows us to cope with challenges. And between the lines, Denis, there is this message that nature is admitting to us, I have no foresight, therefore I am relying on stochasticity and relying on trial and error. I think under that framework, this is extremely Darwinian and adaptive to rely on randomness. Just exploit it.
That's right. Indeed, so within the organism itself, exactly. That's right. And I would only add that I think this happens in the nervous system too.
Absolutely.
Now, there, it is of course also true that we do lay down from our experience of randomly investigating the world, we do lay down some anticipatory modules and that's why, of course, a tennis player, for example, watches the opponent very carefully in order not to watch the ball, but watch the opponent and to judge from the movements of the opponent how he's going to hit that ball. That is anticipation. You may be wrong, of course. That's the chanciness of it all, as we well know. Extremely good tennis players, even exceedingly good ones, can sometimes be wrong. But that's what they're doing. They're using their chance experience many, many times in many games of tennis to effectively develop the equivalent of the immune system, the response in their hands to beat the opponent. It's marvelous. And I think it's going on in the nervous system as well as the immune system.
I totally agree, and I think there is evidence towards that. For instance, there is evidence that, first of all, this whole trial and error in a structured fashion is something that you generate more than you filter. So this is even in our neurons. As a baby is developing, more neurons are actually you have got more neurons, and then you have got connections which are more dense in the beginning. And there is evidence of trial and error, and those connections are pruned out, discarded later on. So
indeed,
to me, it appears a very fast-paced. Actually, the antibody and development in response, like antigen-antibody relationship in response to invasion, that thing, and also within the nervous system, that seems like eerily similar to a fast-paced natural selection happening during the lifetime of the same individual.
Yes, that was actually also the idea of Gerald Edelman many years ago. I think it's back in the 1970s that he published the book Neural Darwinism. And what he meant was precisely what you're describing. That idea, I think, is absolutely correct. The idea that there are many processes within the nervous system by which we have a range of actions that we can call on in our quick reactions to whatever our opponent, whether it's a predator or a tennis player, might produce. And we need to do that, and we do. That's how organisms like humans develop over time and become better at what they're doing.
Okay, so Denis, we will move on to the next question. So following this conversation that we are having right now, so you referred to epigenetics. So you have emphasized a lot during this discussion, and the word epigenetics has come again and again, and especially in the part of denying the neo-Darwinist position and making the evolutionary mechanisms more robust and
Yes.
also adding to the understanding of the evolutionary processes. So
Yes. Indeed.
we know that environment has an effect on an organism, and that effect is epigenetic. That's not going to manifest itself in the genes of that organism, but
No,
in the
right.
extra gene information that is not included in the genes. So this can, as we understand, and as you have already referred, not here, but in your other videos and in your publications, that this can help an organism in adapting a useful variation. It does not let it disappear over the generations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the organism would hang on to that information that his ancestors have gathered.
Yes.
And then it also contributes to the fitness landscape for that organism, and it helps it in establishing the covariance between different traits. So how do you see the effects of epigenetics that an organism goes through in its life, and maybe when it's also in its mother's womb? Or so how important are epigenetics? How do they help in increasing the speed of evolutionary change? And what is the overall effect? Because epigenetics is really fascinating, and it tells us that the mechanism of evolution in itself responds to change.
Yes. Evolution is evolving, is the way some people put it. I certainly have used that expression myself too. Yes, this is very important indeed. You see, the usual answer that the neo-Darwinists will produce, there's a long video by Zach Hancock from the University of Oregon criticizing my views on evolution. This is one of them, incidentally, because he says, look, Denis Noble has got this completely wrong. What he says is that epigenetics can be the origin of a speciation. And I do say that. That's absolutely correct. But then he says, no, that is impossible, because all the experiments, and on this he's absolutely correct, all the experiments show always dies out after just a very few generations. Now, that is absolutely true, but it doesn't answer my point. Evolution does not change a species just because there is a temporary change in the environment. Why should it?
Yeah.
So the experiment in which you first induce an epigenetic change by an environmental change, and then find out how many generations does it persist, is the wrong experiment. The experiment you need to perform is what happens when the environmental change persists for many generations. Then, and only then, should it become incorporated into genetic inheritance. Why on earth should evolution of species respond to a single change?
Wonderful.
In one generation?
Really beautiful explanation, and very simple. The way you put it.
Very simple. If the environmental change inducing the epigenetic change persists and is long-term, there's every reason why the epigenetic change first should persist, and every reason why the organism should then seek, by chance or whatever, to modify its genetic composition so that it's better formed to deal with that environmental change in the long run. But look, it doesn't require that that should be the case, because if that change in environment is permanent for the next million years, who worries about whether it gets incorporated into the genes or not? It will still be there. Which is, I just simply deep misunderstanding of the process of epigenetics.
Absolutely. And I'm glad, Denis, that you have put it so clearly. And I do not know how would anybody miss this point, because what Denis is saying is, let's suppose the change in the environment was just a blip, a short pulse. It's going to be extremely anti-Darwinian to evolve something to cater for a blip which went away. So it's
Exactly.
Darwinian precisely when the change of the environment that triggered the epigenetic variation in the first place persists. So the persistence of epigenetic states, while there is evidence that different kind of epigenetic modifications, I mean, the methylation can go till 5-6 generations. It's not just limited to 3 generations, and there is now evidence that histone modifications can go as deep as 19 generations. So histone modifications can be very deep. But that penetration, as Denis pointed out, that penetration is with that experimental setup, the environmental change was just a blip and then it disappeared. The actual experiment which Denis is actually asking everyone to do is that assume that the environmental state is persistent. So the persistence of epigenetic states is modulated through the persistence of the environment. This is how it works. So this is so beautifully explained, Denis, and I think our audience needs to understand this, that this is so powerful. It's not just, epigenetics is not like some flimsy or temporary thing. Its permanence is reinforced through environment, which is wonderful.
Easily, this is my favorite thing that Dr. Noble explained today.
This is wonderful.
Beautiful.
So also, I think Denis explained that very eloquently as well, that the power of epigenetics is also through the capacity for epigenetics to induce a change in a large population at the same time.
Oh, exactly so. Oh, that's so important.
It's so important,
Could be 70% or 90% even of the population, exactly.
Yeah,
right.
Whereas, so what does that actually mean? I think this is license for us to reinterpret, Denis, that epigenetics is a kind of a horizontal transmission.
Exactly so, because it's cultural or it's environmental. It's a mixture of the two. Exactly so.
So
what do we find?
Remember,
I'm a medical scientist. What do we find when we investigate, for example, schizophrenia? Well, briefly, what we know is this. The Human Genome Project was launched by people who were very convinced that schizophrenia would turn out to be a genetic disease. Why? Because it runs in families. Ask any doctor what he will ask a patient when he complains of something or another. It will be, what did your parents have? We all use that idea that you get an inkling of the genetic inheritance from what is familial. But the problem is sociologically, culturally, families live together. They also tend to live in the same environment as those who have this problem. So what has been shown, this is in a beautiful article by Torrey, Torrey, published just this year, and I think it's Psychiatry Research. There are 300 genes associated with association scores between the presence or absence of that gene and schizophrenia, but none of them explain the phenomenon of schizophrenia. What does is the cultural environment in which those people are living. So epigenetics is not just the physical environment, it's also the sociological environment. Why? Because through our nervous systems, we are extremely sensitive to what people feel about us, what the constraints are sociologically and in terms of poverty or not. All of those processes are processes that have been filtered by what's inside this box that determines our physical state. And that's the way in which the cultural changes can be so important. What Torrey's article shows is that the attempt to treat schizophrenia genetically is just a complete failure.
And specifically, Dennis, when we have evidence that there is variation both at the level of histone modifications and at the level of methylation as well. So even if there is a genetic component, so be it, but it's being modulated through epigenetic factors. So it's really important. And those things, as you mentioned, these things in which environment a person is being brought up, whether the person is under stress, like fear, or being attacked or something, all these things do affect. Like the free-flowing stress hormones that we have, they like affect it in non-trivial ways, all those things. So it is so, I think, of course, I'm not coming from any position of like expertise or authority. I'm just like ordinary student of these things, but like I'm not a psychologist, a psychiatrist. But this question of running in families needs to be reevaluated in light of epigenetics. So this is my humble opinion, just as an outsider onlooker at the field. So, but of course, people are.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not a neuroscientist. I should make that clear. Although I've worked on nerves in my lifetime, but I'm not a standard neuroscientist. But I can read the literature just as much as anybody else can. Torrey's article is an eye-opener in terms of working out whether we were right to follow the instincts of gene-centric biology for the last 50 years or so. We were wrong, unfortunately. We better admit that in time to change direction now and see whether we can find the functional processes that are responsible for a disease and a nervous disability like schizophrenia or indeed Alzheimer, you name it. Fortunately, there are biologists that are trying to take the functional route, and I wish them luck in doing so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talking about that you can read literature on other fields as well. I have no doubt. Of course, I know, Denis, that you are truly multidisciplinary person. So you cross-cut through disciplines. Talking about that, I'd like to have your thoughts about some modeling questions as well. I won't go into too much detail, but as I see, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that you keep tabs on other kinds of literature as well. I think if I'm remembering it correctly, I think a few years ago, maybe in 2020-ish, there was an issue of the philosophical transactions on biological sciences, which was dedicated to celebrating 50 years of the Price's equation. And and I think a few of the papers in that special issue crossed my eyes. And of course, originally when Price formulated his Price equation, which is a kind of a statement, a mathematical statement about the quantification of the expected change that you can expect in a trait, and he was pretty much agnostic to what a trait is, what a source of variation is. It's just anything. It can be applied to anything. Exactly. But lo and behold, what comes out on the right-hand side of that equation is precisely a mathematical covariance term between the fitness and the actual trait. And of course, this is clear, this is well understood, but I think there is a lot of room and need for the modeling folks to step up, because look what epigenetics did. Epigenetics, by inducing that change in a large population at the same time, enables one of the crucial mathematical terms on the right-hand side of the Price's equation. I think, and what I feel is that I think you need to have these kinds of modeling for every modes of inheritance, which are interacting with each other, and a lot of new modeling needs to happen. But look what epigenetics gave us. Epigenetics gave us the mathematical fuel as well to establish the covariance between the fitness and the trait, which I think something people like you and other people need to highlight as well. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I think what we need is the equivalent of what I've been doing all my life, which is dynamic. That means effectively, in most computation, differential equation biology. Now, those are technical terms, and I realize that some of your listeners to this podcast may find that difficult to follow. But roughly speaking, the differential equations in mathematics enable you to understand how this bumps into that and creates this movement this way, and how this influence, magnetic or whatever it might be, means that this will move like that rather than like that, and so on. So it's all the dynamics of how the particles in a system, or the components of a system, move around. But they're all doing so under the constraint of the higher levels of organization. That, incidentally, is the main process in my principle of biological relativity. You cannot solve those equations without those differential equations, without the boundary conditions formed by literally the structure or form of the context within which all of that bouncing around occurs. It's like imagining that you've got tennis balls flying all over the place and not staying in a tennis ball court, and they will just simply fly everywhere. But if there are good boundaries to what the tennis balls can do in being hit out of the court, they'll bounce back. That's an example of a constraint that simply comes from a structural constraint. You look inside any cell of the body, it's completely full of structural constraints on what the molecules can do. Now, to return to the price equation, my problem with that approach to evolutionary biology is simply this: it's terribly good at working out what a stable, steady state might be, given the ability of random changes to occur indefinitely in an evolutionary process. Its problem is, can it describe the dynamics with which an environmental change can induce many organisms in that species to change at the same time, and then to push the process off in a new direction? I don't think it can. I'm not a equation expert, but I seriously don't think it can.
Very nice, very nice. Just a bit of follow-up and a clarification. What I meant by the use of price equation, definitely, Dennis, not in its current form. It is utterly inadequate, and there is need for this modeling it as like differential in the form of a differential equation. In the form of a differential equation. So however, what is so simple and beautiful is that if we consider these steps as discrete, to an extent, that equation is a modeling of one step of that difference equation. And so, but we need to have a system of differential or difference equations. And I think our audience usually have some background in physics. They will understand it, that whenever you solve for a differential equation, you can get a general solution. But in order to get the actual solution, you need the boundary conditions, which Denis just mentioned. It is so important to remember that without the boundary conditions, a differential equation solution doesn't mean anything. It's only when the boundary conditions are put, you have the actual solution. So this is such a good modeling advice as well. From
it's worse than that, isn't it? Because if without the boundary conditions, there's an infinite number of solutions.
Absolutely.
That is mathematically true. Yes, exactly.
Okay. Going back to Darwin again, we were wondering, we've talked a lot about epigenetic changes and how in one generation parents are able to confer, biological adaptations that they've made to their offspring. And Darwin postulated this in the 19th century. With epigenetics, has Darwin's original postulate been proven correct? What do you
That's
think?
what I argue. Exactly so. That's what I argue in a paper published just, I think it was 2023, maybe 2024, but it's in the Journal of Physiology, and it's by Noble and Phillips, and it describes speciation through epigenetics leading the way. Now, that's not a new idea, incidentally. I'm not worried about whether my ideas are new or not. I grab whatever there is to try to integrate it into a better structure for thinking about evolution. So I'm not claiming novelty for that idea that epigenetics can lead speciation. But what we do in that article is to say very clearly that this is a vindication of what Darwin was trying to do during the last 10 years of his life. Because between 1872 and 1882, when he passed away, he collaborated with a physiologist called George Romanes. Hardly anybody today knows about George Romanes. He was sidelined completely. But after Darwin's death, he published in 3 volumes, published in 1886, 4 years after Darwin's death, called Darwin and After Darwin. And in the 3rd volume of that series, he published his idea of what he called physiological selection. Now, he did not know about epigenetics, so he was struggling to find a way in which he could express all of this. If he had known about epigenetics, I am pretty certain he would have formulated his concept of physiological selection even more accurately, because I think that is the way to go forward. What we need now is experiments to test whether that idea is correct. The idea is very simple. Epigenetic change will influence a large fraction of the population. And if the physiological or the psychological change is such that it produces reproductive isolation, you will automatically get branching speciation. It's as simple as that. Now, I'm a physiologist. Many processes that change the structure of the body, psychologically or physically, will do precisely that. You don't need it to happen often, but once it happens, you will get branching speciation. So I think it's a perfectly plausible hypothesis that we could now flesh out what Darwin was trying to do with his collaborator George Romanes during the last decade of his life, and leave it open to experimental tests to see whether it can be shown to work.
Excellent.
Very nice, very nice. So as I mentioned before, and I think Denis also mentioned that Darwin would be celebrated today if he suddenly reappeared and saw that we are talking about epigenetics. He would be thrilled.
Oh, I think he would be delighted, because it was the missing piece in his thinking. He had no idea of this process. He intuited that it must be the case that the environment causes changing in an organism during its lifetime. And that's why he hung on to the idea, some of that at least, must be transmitted to the next generation. That's why he was, although he never used the word, a Lamarckian. But, he didn't use the word Lamarckian for a very good reason. Lamarck was not the originator of this idea at all.
Absolutely.
From everybody else. To Darwin, it didn't seem necessary to refer to Lamarckian processes. He referred to them as use and disuse processes, which is perfectly natural to him. People say sometimes that Darwin never admitted he was a Lamarckian. Well, of course he wouldn't. Historically, it wasn't necessary to do so. It wouldn't even have been. Have been understood. I think that's the best way to put it.
Absolutely. So, Denis, would you like to
see people in the historical context?
So Denis, this is so good. Well, I had something else on my mind as a follow-up, but before I get to that, would you like to elaborate on this thing that why this is a misnomer to associate the transmission of acquired characteristics purely with Lamarck in historical perspective? Please go ahead, because this needs to be clarified.
The answer is very simple. I've read Lamarck in his original language. I have completely fluent French. I lecture in French when I go to French-speaking countries. That gives you a very interesting insight. For example, just before I go into answering your specific question, you understand that the word evolution, I'm giving it now its French pronunciation, means something interestingly different. It actually means process. It is it's used in embryology all the time. Evolution de l'embryon, the evolution of the embryo, is a process that occurs, that it changes with time. So to Lamarck, first of all, he never used the word evolution. No reason why he should have. He did identify speciation. He didn't call it speciation either. What he did was draw a diagram of how the different species might relate to each other with a tree of life. But the reason his idea of the giraffe reaching up higher and higher to eat the leaves off trees, leading to giraffes being born with that characteristic, which is his use and disuse idea, which Darwin also had, he never called that by any particular name, and certainly not Lamarckism, because many biologists before him had made exactly the same assumption. Darwin himself, therefore, was just following, for example, his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, as one of the earliest. And you can go way back even to Aristotle, 2,000 years previously, with much the same idea. There must be something transmitted from the organism to its subsequent generations, and why not some of the changes too? It just seemed so obvious. So it wasn't called Lamarckism in Lamarck's time. It wasn't called Lamarckism in Darwin's time also. So when people say Darwin never admitted that he was a Lamarckian, there was absolutely no reason why he should, nor would he have been understood if he had said so. That's the essence of the point.
Yeah, very nicely put. Like, associating the transmission of acquired characteristic purely with Lamarck is a historical mistake.
It's just a historical mistake. And Lamarck would never have claimed. Now, what did he do? He is phenomenal. He first of all defined the word biology. Biologie in French is the first time that word was used. Second, he championed the idea of what he called the transformation of species. That was his word for speciation. So transformationism, the French is more or less that, transformation des species. Anyway, he used that word rather than evolution. But he had the concept, and he even drew a tree of life 27 years before Darwin's major break in 1837 in his notebook B, where he drew a little sketch showing how speciation could occur from branching, which of course he associated with his experiences in the Galapagos Islands. I could go on. You know, Lamarck was a great biologist. He should never have been denigrated in the way that the neo-Darwinists have done.
Yeah, that is funny, actually, the way they engage in considering Lamarckian as some kind of a derogatory thing, which is so
it's
funny.
Worse than that. It's even worse than that. In Futuma's great textbook, Evolution, published by Oxford University Press, and I think Sinar in the United States. Anyway, Douglas Futuma represents Lamarck as having the thesis of evolution of his great opponent, Georges Cuvier. You'll find it, I think, on page 19 of Futuma's textbook. It's crazy. He gives to Lamarck the idea of individual creations that is the idea of Georges Cuvier, not of Lamarck. So it's worse than that. It's the neo-Darwinists have actually not only misunderstood Lamarck in terms of his theory of use and disuse and why it became called Lamarckism, but also attributing to Lamarck himself the wrong theory that he developed in his book Philosophie zoologique in 1809. I've looked at the first edition of those books, and you'll see in the second volume, it's in 2 volumes. In the second volume, towards the very end of the book, there's a clear drawing of a tree of life. Does Futuyma reproduce that? Do any of the neo-Darwinists reproduce it? No. You'll not find that anywhere in the textbooks today.
Very nice, very nice.
Should we move on? Okay,
please.
We should move on to the final thing that we want to discuss with you. So we've discussed a lot about speciation, Darwinism, and neo-Darwinism, the Darwinian framework, and how the neo-Darwinist position is incomplete, and maybe even it muddies the water, and we never get the clear picture if we just stick to that. Yes. So coming back to Darwin, if I ask you, how do you think that the Darwinian framework, in the light of current understanding, provides a better explanation for speciation? Because speciation is actually the biggest question that is always related to evolution, and it is the topic of debate between the evolutionists and anti-evolutionists. So can you please elaborate on this?
Yes, I think that, well, I wonder whether I can make a little bit of a diversion initially, but it'll come back to what I think you're getting at. Mm-hmm. I think there has been a very unfortunate development in some countries in particular, and I include the United States in this category, it may surprise you, in which
not at all.
There has been, it seems to me, a very unnecessary and vituperative argument between religious believers and the evolutionary biologists. There's no particular reason why that should exist. Here in the United Kingdom, there are very few who would argue that we have to go back to the idea that the Earth is 7,000 years old, or whatever the number is, and that everything was created in 7 days, whatever it might be. And the reason for that is that all the major religious positions here in the United Kingdom, and I don't mean just Christianity, more or less accept that the evolutionary process has happened. Of course, they will have their own theological gloss on that this is the process by which the creator did his work. All right, it's up to them. I will say, all that I can say about that is it's not science. We cannot deal with that kind of question. But it's up to them. And I think that this is a very unfortunate thing that's developed in the United States particularly, because creationism, literal creationism, is still so very strong and still a cause of tension between evolutionary biologists and those who have religious beliefs. And it doesn't need to be the case. And the United Kingdom is not the only example. I travel a lot in countries that are strongly Buddhist. There's nothing in the Buddhist religion. It's more or less a practice than a religion. Sometimes I find it very difficult to describe it as a religion. But there's nothing in it that is that contains a story of how the world was created, which could in any way compete with what scientists are investigating. So my slight diversion before coming back to your question is that a lot of this argument between those of religious belief and those that don't, or our scientists just simply investigating whether or not they have religious beliefs, has been pointless. And it's very unfortunate that that argument has become so vituperative and so difficult to deal with. Now, to come back to the real point of your question, I think that it's very important to note something else that my critic, Zach Hancock, has highlighted in his recent broadcast, which is this. It is also not possible, if one is a true Darwinist, to deny that organisms have agency. Agency is something that Darwin described in his 1871 book when he said, in effect, that peacock displaying itself to the crowd of peahens surrounding it is selecting who it wants to breed with. And those peahens are also selecting who they will want to breed with. What does that do? We know what human breeders do when they select, they develop new species. Darwin, therefore, was quite clear that this ability to choose was a characteristic that occurs in organisms other than we as humans. He gave it to birds, and I think he was absolutely right to do so. Now, the point I'm coming to is very simply this. People sometimes say that science leaves us without a sense of purpose. It is so, as it were, mechanical. Well, first of all, it isn't. The world is stochastic, not mechanical. That's just a mistake on the part of some people in thinking that somehow science automatically produces mechanism in its thinking and modeling of what life does. If you harness stochasticity, you are not mechanical. That's at the origin of our creativity. But I think it's also the origin of our ability in life to form our purposes. And it's very important, I think, in this argument sometimes between those who are concerned with the well-being of humanity to recognize that there's no real reason why science should deny that. On the contrary, we should investigate what's in this box. We should find out how we can be so creative in what we do. And that, of course, is what some physiologists are now trying to do. I can quote many people who do it.
Okay, so Substantia also has some line of discussion and some thing to add here, or maybe ask something.
Yeah, Dennis summed it up beautifully, because what he just said is that it's part of the Darwinian framework. It would be extremely anti-Darwinian to say that sexual selection, because sexual selection, in a way, I mean, it was already there, this understandings. Isn't it the case that sexual selection is providing direction to the process of evolution? It was always very clear. I mean, we don't have to, we do not need other examples. Sure enough, there can be other examples, but organisms mating with one another, there is a mating bias. Okay, so first of all, and it would be extremely anti-Darwinian to say that sexual selection or mating bias cannot evolve, because that in itself fuels the evolutionary process. And that's akin to saying that, you know what, that's actually akin to taking evolution out of evolution. I mean, the whole evolved
process. Taken. That's right.
Yeah. So one thing, Ghalib's question was, of course, in the context of speciation as well, Denis, and I would like you to shed some light on speciation as viewed through the lens of sexual selection. Precisely why? Because, I mean, if we go to older literature in speciation studies, it is very clear that I think by end 90s, it was very clear that geographical separation may not be the necessary condition for speciation or for groups to diverge. Right. It makes sense intuitively that maybe you need to have a little bit of geographical separation and then the groups diverge. That's like classical thinking. But as far as the experiments go, it was patently clear that even without geographical separation, subgroups within the same population, cohabiting the same space, sharing the same space, can actually diverge. And the lens of sexual selection is so powerful because through that sexual preferences, different subgroups tend to mate with different subgroups, establishing a reproductive isolation between subgroups sharing the space. And there's a lot of literature. There's a lot of literature on the role of sexual selection in speciation. I think some of the two standard examples are ones that come from the African lake cichlid fishes, where there are reproductively isolated groups, and the only thing that they differ in remarkably is the male coloration and the female preference for that color. And in crickets, in Hawaiian crickets, they are reproductively isolated groups, but the only way things actually differ is in terms of the details of the male courtship song. So that is it is very clear. So now with that lens, that sexual selection can be a force behind speciation. What are your thoughts? I think you have written yourself as well your own paper with Phillips. So please go ahead and elaborate on this.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very pleased to do so. First of all, psychological preference is just as powerful as physical preference. I mean, just to clarify that, it's very obvious that people or organisms generally choosing who to mate with will determine the direction in which evolution occurs. It's natural. It'll reinforce what in the minds of one of the organisms reproducing, male or female, is regarded as beautiful or as desirable, at least, in the other. And it's obvious to us humans too that the concept of beauty differs in totally different ways in different cultures. To a Westerner, first encountering people from the Far East, it's very strange. The concept of beauty is so built around a particular ideal, and all cultures develop their ideals. And that itself, it's psychological, of course, but it's just as powerful as selection by any other process. So my view, very simply, is that we've got to bring sexual selection and more generally what I would call social selection back into evolutionary biology. Because by social, I'm dissociating it from being necessarily associated with sexual intercourse, with breeding. Because if we help those we like, we give them a better chance in life. So even the celibate uncles and aunts can have an influence, and certainly grandmothers can. You see what I'm getting at? It isn't just, I don't think Darwin would have disagreed with this, it isn't just sexual selection, it's social selection in general. And a very major biologist who proposed this idea way back in 1962, Wynne Edwards, who published a book in 1962 on the, I can't remember the exact title at the moment, but if one looks Wynne Edwards, it's a double-barreled name, up very easy to find it. I think it's called Animal Dispersion or something like that. Anyway, he proposed that different groups within organisms could be selected for by the very process of natural selection, favoring this group rather than that group. He called it group selection. The neo-Darwinists rubbished it, and during the 1960s and 1970s, it was almost a badge of honor to show how each of Wynne Edwards' ideas could be explained by the maths of evolutionary biology as conceived by the neo-Darwinists. Wynne Edwards replied to that with a little letter in Nature. He said, you haven't been with me in the wild, into nature itself, to watch what happens. Your maths doesn't describe that.
Wow.
Powerful.
Yeah, even if you think of, I think John Maynard Smith, who was a very gene-centric person, towards the end, he was very much convinced that there is what is it that he said? Maybe cytoplasmic inheritance, something like that.
Yes,
John Maynard Smith.
He wrote, you're quite correct. He wrote in, I think, his book Evolutionary Genetics, Lamarckism is not so obviously false as people make out.
Very
Actually,
nice.
he was very doubtful about the Weissman barrier. Yeah.
Yeah. So John Maynard Smith, we talk about John Maynard Smith on our Urdu channels. You might be surprised, and in the context of evolutionary game theory and evolutionarily stable strategies. So he's the same guy, Ghalib, that we are talking about.
Yeah.
Even that person who was once upon a time very gene-centric, towards the end, he was pretty open to Lamarckism. So these aspects need to be told to, I would say, young biologists, at least.
I think so. I have a lot of admiration for John Maynard Smith. I used to meet him in meetings in London at, I think it was the SIBA Foundation Symposia. He was a very interesting man, always open to discussion, outside the framework of neo-Darwinism, if necessary. He stayed within the framework, though, in the end, and I think largely because at that time there wasn't any kind of organized environment, if we can call it that, within which thinking outside the framework of neo-Darwinism could occur. I think John himself was quite close to not being a modern synthesis person. He stayed with it because, after all, it's a very powerful and persuasive argument. Richard Dawkins, he uses it in great, brilliant writing in his books like The Selfish Gene. It's just that I think it's incorrect.
Yeah, we needed, on a lighter note, we needed some major epigenetic changes in the environment to make sure that people start taking other modes of inheritance seriously.
I think so, yes, exactly. We need a cultural shift. That's absolutely right.
Absolutely.
We've gone on for 2 hours.
So we are at the end, Dr. Noble. We really thank you for this opportunity to learn from you. And I'm really glad we had this conversation. Momo and Substantia, would you like to add anything in the end before we take Dr. Noble's closing remarks?
I would just like to thank Denis for taking 2 hours of his time and talking to us. And you're going to reach a huge number of people, especially in Pakistan, who are, going to enjoy this conversation and learn from it and be inspired. So I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you so much, Denis.
My pleasure.
Thank you again, Denis. I can't thank you enough for taking the time out. We have been learning through your lectures and videos and your publications all along. So I would really thank you. And if you have to, I really want to encourage our audience to read about what Denis has contributed to as a specimen, as an exhibit 001 coming from Denis's desk, is that paper on harnessing stochasticity, which is the very definition of the basic fuel of new variations stemming from randomness. I think that view has been put so eloquently by using this phrase of harnessing stochasticity. So that is really important for students in biology to understand that, yes, there are levels of order, levels of organization, but deep down the novelty is coming through randomness. And this is precisely what Denis terms as harnessing stochasticity. So thank you again, Denis. You can give some concluding remarks for our audience.
I'm very happy to tidy this up. Incidentally, on harnessing stochasticity, those who would like to go further can find the relevant articles on my own website, Denis Noble, just one word, put the two parts of my name together, .com. On
We will
there,
put
you
it
will
in
find.
on the bottom. Yeah.
That's right. It's www.denisnoble.com. You'll find a button that links to the Harnessing Stochasticity collection. That's the set of articles that outline the whole concept of harnessing stochasticity. So with that, I thank you very much for inviting me to come on your broadcast, and I've greatly enjoyed what has been a literally in-depth discussion. Thank you all very much.
It's a huge pleasure, and we're really glad to have you. Thank you very much. So, audience, you can look up Dr. Noble's website. You can look up his publications, his books, and you would learn a lot from him, as we have learned a little from him today. You know, if you read his books, you would learn a lot from him. And we would like to thank everyone who is watching, and especially Dr. Noble, who came and discussed and gave us a very brilliant insight into the latest developments in the field of evolutionary biology. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.